I'd like to talk a bit about annotation in AutoCAD. And this is what I mean by annotation are things like text for room names, for notes, and also dimensions. So let's start with text. I like to just use multi-line text, M-T-E-X-T, text. Multi-line text is a form of text in AutoCAD that allows you to keep typing, and it scrolls for you, and it gives you sort of a lot of editing commands. I'm just going to draw a box to represent how big I want the text to be. And it brings up the multi-line text editor where I can type in whatever I want. Dining room, for example. Okay. And I can change the size of the text editor. I have all the sort of editing commands that you'd expect, including size and undo and underlines and all sorts of things there. And of course, we love changing the fonts. So I'll just click Save, and there it is. It's a piece of text. And this text is an object that you can copy and paste. And of course, the layer assignment for these pieces of text is very important. So in this case, I'm going to let's just put this kind of in the middle of the room. Multi-line text, if you want to know what, if you want control over sort of all new text and the style that it's going to be represented in, just type the word style, and up pops the text style menu. And what you'll see, there's a number of different styles that may or may not be in your drawing, depending on if you've imported blocks that have styles attached with them. Most of these I didn't create. What I'm going to use is what's called the annotative text style. And if you're using the template distributed with the class, that's the style that shows up as default. What AutoCAD has done with this annotative text style is it forces your text style to always be the same height when you print it. And those old timers who people who've used AutoCAD for a long time, they know that text styles often are a real nightmare because they like to print at different scales. So you used to have to know what size the print was in scale. This is the actual physical size, not the 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch scale. Okay, so I would recommend always using the annotative text style. When you want to put in, say, a note with a leader line, you can also use what's called the mleader command, mleader. And the way that works, and of course AutoCAD will guide you through it with the tooltip here. You want to point the arrowhead somewhere, and as you do that, you get a rubber band line which indicates where the kind of next part of the arrow goes. Often leader lines are pulled off the drawing so that all the notes can be kind of neatly lined up. Click again to kind of define where the tail of that thing goes and the start of the text. And you might say, you know, something like existing wood floor. Okay? And hit save. And now you have a piece of multi-line text. And what's nice about this is this text can be moved after the fact if you want. And if I have lots of notes, I will often draw a line so that when I have more than one leader line, I can use that line as a reference. Existing brick. I don't actually know if it's brick, but it sure sounds good. And you see how now I can delete this line, and look how nice and neat that is, all the leader lines lining up. Okay, and if you don't like the curvy style that I'm using here, you can type in mleader style, okay, and it brings up the leader style, and by default it is using the annotative style. To edit that, you just click the modify command, and it will give you all the options for the multi-leaders. I typically use a spline because I think it looks nice, but some people prefer the straight view. And of course, any office that you work in will be having their own formatting that they prefer. You know, some people like dots or boxes or other things. And of course, you can always define your own, which is a great way to kind of add a little style to your projects. So lines, we have text, lines of text. We have leader lines with text. Now let's put in some dimensions. Now I use a very simple command called dimlin. Linear dimension is what it creates. And what you do is you click on the points that you want to measure. So for example, let's say I'm just going to measure this overall part of the wing of the house. This creates a linear dimension off to the right. So typically you do the overall dimension, and if you put one dimension in and you want to continue it, type in dim continue. And what you will get is it will AutoCAD will pick up where you left off with the last dimension, and just hit escape to finish the dimension string. Now you also have I'm just going to hit enter to I'm going to type in dimlin to make a new set of dimensions, and you typically have kind of overall dimensions, and then you have kind of the detail level dimensions. I'm going to dimension here the door location, and I'll type in the dim continue to continue making these sort of individual pieces dimensioned. Okay, and I could even keep going down on this side of the wall. Okay, and you end up with these nice, very neat kind of tiers or strings of dimension. In fact, in the old days, I believe they actually used a string to line up all the dimensions. And in this case, I have two wings of the building. I could add one overall to show me what the kind of overall dimension of the building is. See how I have three different tiers. Okay. Now, dimensions, by the way, it's a little tricky, but if you get their properties, you want to make sure that they are on the correct layer for what you want to print. Now right now I have these on the walls layer because that happened to be the option that I had up. But make sure that you put them on the dimensions in plan and elevation layer if that's where you want them to occur. And you'll see soon enough there's a reason for that, because dimensions that occur in, say, the reflected ceiling plan are going to occur in exactly the same location. Now, dimensions, if you click on them, they have a number of grips available. And you can see here I can just click on the grips to edit them. Just be aware that, here I'll click on this grip and drag it over to the endpoint. And now I have a nice little gap here between the end of the dimension leader line and the actual string. And this is kind of the graphic standards for the way these things look. The other thing is, if I want to override the text, for example, this says 26 feet 11 and a half. I could override that text in this same properties menu. I can just type in some new value, 26 feet dash 3 inches, and VIF, for example, for verify in field. And when I hit escape or close the properties menu, that indicates, well, I'm not really sure how big that is. You should verify it in the field. Another thing that you typically will do with linear dimensions, I'm just going to put in a dimension between these windows. And these window spacing, it's pretty typical on this side of the building. So you could select the text and type in 9 1/2 inches, TYP, which stands for typical. Okay. The other thing that you can do is frequently we adjust the position of text so that it's easier to read. You see how this text is all overlapping? I can use the grip here to move the text off to the side, or just above it, or off to the left. Okay. This is probably the easiest to read, and maybe I'll move this guy over just a little bit too. Okay, so it's up to you to how you position these, but just make sure you take a look at how AutoCAD places things so that they are actually legible. The other thing is that AutoCAD will select how precise it wants to be based on the units in the drawing. These units can be changed. You just type in the word units, and enter. And this is where you would set your drawing to, for example, decimal degrees if you're going for metric, like the rest of the world. The other thing is that you can change the precision of the drawing. So our dimensions look very nice here in plan. Now we need to talk about how do we get this thing to actually print and print it in the correct size that we want. Now the template that we're using, I would strongly recommend anytime you want to print to scale in AutoCAD, anytime you want to have your text and dimensions show up at the correct size printed, I would strongly recommend you use that template. And the reason is it has a couple of sheets already made, and it has all the dimension styles and everything already placed in it. Okay, so let's talk about printing our sheet of drawings here. When you print from AutoCAD using this template that has the ready-made sheet, I'm using the 24 by 36 sheet. I've set this up with a couple of different views of your model. This is the way it works. It's basically a sheet of paper, and it has these objects on the sheet of paper called viewports. These are objects that can be rectangular, they can also be other shapes, and they are views into the model space here. So here's my model. If I select something, for example, and I go to this sheet, that same object is right here. I can enter the viewport and basically reach through the sheet of paper into the original model by just double-clicking on it. And what you'll see is my view commands become active. I can pan. I would just recommend not zooming in and out because each viewport, in this case, is already set to some kind of scale. And I'll show you what I mean. If I click off of the viewport and just click on its edge, see how the edge is highlighted? That's different than when I clicked in the middle to enter the viewport. I'll just double-click outside of it to exit the viewport and click on the edge of the viewport, and I'm going to get the properties of that viewport. And what you'll see is it has a scale associated with it. You can choose which scale you're using, and there are all sorts of scales, including engineering scales, and if you switch your drawing units to metric, these will be metric scale. The other thing to notice is there's two drop-down lists here, one for the scale, what's called the standard scale, one for the annotation scale. Now, these are very tricky, but this is how AutoCAD assures that your drawing is printed to scale and that the text is printed at the correct size. First of all, the viewport can be set to any scale. So if I click on, I'm going to hit Escape and select this viewport, you'll see that the standard scale is 1/2 of an inch, and that makes sense. It's now twice as big as the drawing over here, which is at 1/4 inch scale. What you'll also notice is that the annotation scale is set to 1/2 an inch, equals a foot. What that means is if I double-click inside this viewport, and let's just say I want to put in a linear dimension. I'll draw it over here. Then I'm going to double-click outside of it. What you should see is that this size text is twice as big as this size text in the drawing in model space. Let's go to model space and we should see it. Or I'm sorry, half as big. See, I've got my scales backwards. See how big this piece of text is? There, we can see it much better here. This text is way bigger than this piece of text. And the reason is this is supposed to print at 1/2 inch scale. This is supposed to print at 1/4 inch scale. So let me go back to the sheet here. And what you'll see is that it's entirely possible to have dimensions at many different scales. I'm going to go to this drawing and do the same thing. Dim lin. Put in a linear dimension. It's the same dimension every single time. You see how it's all the same size on this sheet. But if I go over here to my model space See how one is way bigger than the other. And in model space, you can do all your dimensioning like we did before. Just be aware that the annotation scale, when you draw in model space, you can choose this. So you actually do have to kind of think ahead and think about how big my drawing is going to be when I print it. Okay, and that is something you'll have to just remember to do. So right now, if I draw in a linear dimension, it will come in a third size. And I'm actually going to put it right here in the middle. What you'll see when you go to the sheet of drawings, paper space, is that the linear dimension here shows up in 1/4" scale. It shows up as a different one in 1/2 inch, or what is this, 1/8 inch, and at 1/2 inch. These are 3 different dimension strings, each tied to the scale of the viewport. Okay, so critical thing when you're in this viewport, double-click inside it to view around. You can pan all you like. Don't zoom, though. Watch what happens when I zoom. You see how now it's relative to the sheet, this drawing has gotten a little bit bigger, and when you go and you get the properties of that viewport, you'll see that the standard scale, it now says custom. And that's because I've messed around with the zooming. My advice is set it to the scale you want, and then what I do is I lock the display. What that means, just locks this one viewport. Now I can double-click inside the viewport. I can try to pan, I can try to zoom, but it won't let me because I've locked this viewport. And if you're like me and you're very careless in scrolling, that is a great way to avoid messing up the scale of your drawing. Notice how, by the way, that the association with the text remains the same. Even though I've locked the display, I can still add text and it will be at 1/4" scale. So that is how you add text to your drawing and print it to scale. When I double click on this block, however, what you'll see is an attribute editor pops up. And what this is, each of these pieces of text isn't a normal piece of text. It's a piece of text with what's called an attribute. And that basically means it's a spot where you can fill in some text. And if I change this to be Endicott's really cool tea house and click OK, what you'll see is that it changes the text on the block. Okay. Now, of course, I made a spelling error, and that's kind of a silly name for this project anyway. If you want to edit the block, and not just the attributes, you'll have to go to the block editor. And now you can come in here and make all sorts of changes, including the size of the text and other things. All right, I'm not going to do any more editing on that. Now, when you want to print, it's a little tricky, and in fact, I have a separate video describing in greater detail how to print AutoCAD drawings from both Mac and PC versions. But the upshot is, and kind of this is the quick version, when you go to print, and I'm just going to do Command P, I'm on the Mac side right now, it brings up a print menu. What you'll see is that my print manager has my home printer set up here, and that's obviously a little bit small from our 24 by 36 sheet. What you'll want to do is save this as a PDF. In your typical printing situation, you just don't want to print directly from an AutoCAD file. You want to have a PDF, and there's a number of reasons for this. Sometimes you want to edit the PDF in a photo editor to enhance it or add materials or other fun things. But the other thing is it's pretty much a guarantee that your line weights will come out correctly. Whereas if you print directly from AutoCAD, there's all sorts of print drivers and other issues. So saving it as a PDF is the best option. On a Mac, you'll have this option here, Save as PDF. And it will take whatever the original page size was, and you can, here, I'll just put it somewhere where I'll be able to figure out where it is, maybe the desktop, and I'll call it for print. Okay. And what you'll see is that it will print the sheet and create a PDF file here. Okay, And that should make a nice print file that you can take to the printer and fire away. Now, the PC version is a little bit different because you don't have that Save as PDF option. Here I have a sheet of drawings, and by the way, while we're looking at it, you can see that there are all sorts of dimensions on this. There are all sorts of interior elevations and that sort of thing. I'm going to go and type Control P to print this window. And what it will give you is a warning. Do you want to try this batch plot? The PC version, I think, is a little better set up for printing multiple pages. In this case, I only have this one sheet that I want to print, and in fact, I'm going to tell it to stop telling me this because I don't like it. And I'll continue to just plot the one sheet. The Windows version of AutoCAD makes up for not having a Save as PDF option by having this DWG to PDF option. And what this does is it does basically the same thing. It'll save the view as a PDF based on whatever sheet size you have. And there are, of course, a lot of architectural sheet sizes out there. This also gives you the full range of options, including quality, scale. Scale is always 1:1 when you're printing from paper space. If you reduce the scale of paper space, it will change the scale of the drawing. So be very careful. Don't fiddle around with that unless you're doing a check plot. Typically, it plots the layout. Some people plot from model space. I don't recommend it just because it's kind of a little more confusing, frankly. I always print in the layout myself. Anyway, the other thing that it can be quite confusing is this monochrome.ctb. Typically, we print AutoCAD drawings in black and white, and this monochrome.ctb will control all your colors in your model and basically make them look like they are black and white. Okay, and it will be a solid black. It will not be grayscale. So if you're having trouble printing to color, or it's coming out in color, then this is probably where the problem is. Anyway, when you click OK, it will ask you where do you want to save it. And I think we saved it as that last time. This is the PDF file that you can then send. And what you can see from the PDF here is, whoops, wrong button, that it has the line weights, it has the hatching, and it has the text all in the correct scale. So that is kind of the summary of how to print. You know, you always should use a PDF file. That's at least my recommendation, unless you're planning to print something that's not to scale. Now, the only other thing I wanted to mention while I have this view up is just how messy model space can be. I'm going to go to the model space of this person's drawing, and what you'll see is that each project, it often looks very messy. See how all these different objects are on top of each other? There's flooring, there's ceiling, there's actually 3 different design options. They're all drawn right on top of each other. How do you know what's going on in this view? Well, the way that you know what's going on is that you use layers within each viewport to control what's visible. You see how I have a legend for the floor plan and a legend for the design options. I guess the option 1 and option 2 right on top of each other. When you go to the design options sheet, what you'll see, zoom in a little bit here, I'm going to double click inside this viewport. I'm going to call up my layers menu, and what you'll see is that in each viewport you can turn on and off whether or not this layer is visible, and that's over here in this VP freeze column. So I am in the design option 1 viewport. So what I would want to do is make sure that any layers for design option 1, and let me just stretch this out a little bit, sorry, there's a lot of properties here. I would want to make sure that the correct layer is selected, and that it's this design option 2 layer. See how it's got a little frosty symbol next to it? That turns it off. Design option 1 is on. Now, if I close my Layers menu and go into this viewport, see how it's highlighted, call up the Layer menu again, what you'll see is that Design Option 2, let me zoom in on, you can see that Design Option 2 is, has the little sun next to it, that means it's on. Design Option 1 has the little frosty symbol next to it, and that means it's off. So this is how you can control layer visibility on different viewports, is just by freezing or thawing layers within that viewport. The trick is make sure that you do this layer control while you're inside the viewport. The viewport is highlighted, the boundary here. If I click outside of it and I go to my layer menu and start turning on and off layers, it will turn them on and off everywhere. So you do have to be very careful about that. But now I can have these side by side. On a Mac, let me go to the Mac version of AutoCAD. It's a little more, I don't know, annoying isn't the right word. I guess just problematic. When you go to the Layer menu, you just have to make sure that the Viewport Freeze option is visible in the menu. Sometimes the default layout for the Layers menu on the Mac does not show that Viewport Freeze. You'll have to go down here, right-click on a blank area of the viewport, of the Layers menu, and make sure that you've turned on Viewport Freeze. Okay. Then within each viewport, you can do the thing which we did before, which is call up the Layer menu and make sure that the correct design option is visible, or if you wanted to hide the walls, for example, in this view, you'd have to come in here, click the freeze in the current layer, current viewport option. And again, I'll zoom in on that so you can see it. There's a little freeze button there. By the way, the Mac version, the kind of button is hidden until you mouse over it. So it can be a little tricky to find. But then you just click on it to turn it off. And now you see how all my walls have disappeared in this viewport, but not in this one or this one or this one. Okay, so using the freeze in current viewport idea, you can do all sorts of things. Create plans with have design options visible in them right on top of each other. You can also do a reflected ceiling plan right over the floor plan. And this is very, very helpful because you can put in the lighting right over the furniture or align it with other things that might only show up in the floor plan. And then when you get to the reflected ceiling plan viewport, you just hide those layers that aren't supposed to show up. So to summarize what we learned here, it's possible to put in dimensions and text and other items, and you can control how that text prints by using the annotative text style and the annotative dimension styles. Those use the scale of the dimension of the viewport to determine whether or not they're going to be printed and to force the text to be the correct size when you print the sheet. When you go to print a sheet, it's always a good idea to use a PDF to make sure you get the quality that you want, and you can control what is shown on the viewports on that sheet by using the freeze or thaw in current viewport option.